Hi, this is Mike Erickson. Can you hear me? Hi, Deborah.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. I'm sharing my screen, so I don't know if you can see it. Successful?
I can see it. I can see it. Yeah.
Good. And best news is I can hear you and see you. So
Okay,
uh,
great.
this is a good success story.
I just want to say my internet has been going in and out. I'm not sure what's going on my end. I kept having to get out and get back in. So if that's the case and you don't see me, just keep it rolling, and I'm going to come right back.
Sounds like I'll do my best. Okay. No
Okay.
promises, but you're doing great. You're doing great work. So, how does it work? Should I right now stop sharing my screen, or do you think we should just go ahead and just start it that way? What do you think?
That's fine. I'm waiting for George to get on. He should be coming on soon. Actually, he should be on. So let me just introduce you, because we do have some people that are in the are watching right now. So
Of course.
first of all, I'd like to say to everyone who is with us, thank you for participating in our We Mean Business 2020 virtual conference. And welcome to the Disparities in Business and Property Ownership session. My name is Deborah Davis. I am the Cincinnati Regional Director of Minority Business Assistance Center and your moderator for this session. Before we get started, I want to introduce our distinguished guest. With us right now is Dr. Michael Erickson. He is an associate professor of real estate at the University of Cincinnati, an academic director of the UC Real Estate Center. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics and biology from Gonzaga University and a PhD in economics from Syracuse University. He was previously on the faculty at the University of Georgia and Texas Tech University. Dr. Erickson's research focuses on low-income housing markets, and he has worked on projects concerning the low-income housing tax credit program, housing vouchers, home safety modifications, and disparities in home ownership. His recent research has appeared in the Journal of Public Economics, American Economic Journal, Economic Policy, Journal of Urban Economics, and Real Estate Economics. He is also currently on the board of directors of the American Real Estate and Urban Economics Association and co-chair of the association's 2019 and 2010 National Conference. He's received financial support for his research from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the National Institutes of Health, and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And lastly, his research has also been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Frontline, National Public Radio, All Things Considered, Money Magazine, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and Money Watch. Thank you so much, Dr. Erickson, for being with us today.
No, thanks for having me. I just want to say it's it's great to be here. But also, as far as I think this conference is great. I think these conferences are really important to have. So as far as Deborah, just thank you for everything you do with this conference. Thanks for moderating this session, and I look forward to sharing my recent research and then hopefully a good discussion at the end. So thank you, Deborah, very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. So we're waiting. Go ahead, Dr. Erickson, and get started. Mr. Middleton is backstage. I've got to reroute him to where we are right now. So just go ahead, and I'm going to take care of this.
Great. Okay. So hopefully everybody can't see my screen. So I'm sharing today. It's a little bit different than the last session. I'm going to share a recent research project that was actually published or was accepted to be published a couple of weeks ago at Real Estate outside of it. Real Estate Economics, like a journal. This is Sean Bond, who is my colleague at University of Cincinnati, who's now at the University of Queensland inside of Australia. This is a project we actually started about, 5 years ago now. But before I do that, I just want to talk a little bit more. So I'm the academic director of the UC Real Estate Center and the program. I would love to just talk about, at some point, if you're ever interested in thinking about a certificate in, and getting involved with commercial real estate, always happy just to talk. We could talk, more at the end as well if you have any questions, but please always feel free to reach out to me. I'm always free just to chat. So what really started this research, really a number of years ago. Let's see. Oh, there it is. What was basically this large and persistent gap in, as far as homeownership rate. So what you see on the left of your screen is really the homeownership rates from 1870, so right after the Civil War, going up to 2007. This is from the decennial censuses, not my own research, but what it shows you is in 1870 between whites and blacks, there was a 49 percentage point gap in the homeownership rates. What's really, I think, a success story of the country is really over the next 30 years, that gap closed to only about 26 percentage points. What's, I think, somewhat of a black eye of our history was basically for the next 120 years, we've essentially kept homeownership rates pretty constant. And especially, or the gap between, white and, as far as black households. So just kind of shows you the history. The big thing noticed there, we'll get back at the end, is notice in the 1940s, really in response to creation of the FHA, the GI Bill, there's a dramatic rise in homeownership rates everywhere. But honestly, it wasn't as proportional as perhaps it should be. What you can see on the right of the screen is, my own calculations from the current population survey, really from 1994. Where you see that the non-Hispanic white household was about 70% as far as homeowners, as compared to, let's say, the African American families was as far as the 42.1. So this was 1994. That was a 27.7% gap, which is pretty similar actually to what it was 100 years earlier. Now, if we look and we kind of go forward. Really the lowest point in the next 25 years was there's a 26 percentage point gap right around the very last quarter of 2000. So again, there was a gap, like it did decrease. And if you look at really basically where we're at like today, and really the all-time lows is we're really coming off of the homeownership rates for African Americans today is about 40.6. But in the last and the high was the 49.4%. So, but if we look at what they are as of second quarter 2020, and there's kind of a funny dip there, what you see basically is we have a 29 percentage point gap, which is kind of reemerged. It's actually worse than it was 25 years ago. And that kind of increased from, like 40.6 to 47 percent. That's largely due to actually like the dissolution of households. And these households aren't going away. It's people, like moving in and more of a crowding situation with, as far as loved ones and relatives. So again, be kind of careful of any, recent like statistics you might hear. Whenever you think about as far as homeownership rates, there has to be a household to be an owner. And unfortunately, we've really seen a dissolution of really, all households, especially African-American households, just due to, as far as like homelessness. So something just to be aware of that this gap exists. Really, my other passion, which I always like worked on is really the racial like disparities in wealth as well. So if we would look at in 1963, there's about $131,000 gap in the average wealth of a white versus a non-white household. By 1983, that was a 5 times more wealth for a white household than, and this was on average. We jumped to 2016, that's now 7 times. So again, these are averages, but the disparities are real. More importantly, and I think what really, like motivated this research was actually if we look at the, like disparities by age. So if we look at the average kind of like 20-year-old, the white versus African-American like household, there is a difference. It's 3 times. Neither one really has much wealth. But as we see over the life course, and particularly, towards the end of life, is where you see the most dramatic like differences, where, it goes up to 5, 7, and even 10 times like greater for, those households over the age of like 60 years old. So again, these disparities are real. We know that they increase over age. And then the question is kind of where do we go from this? And really what started this research was, what is the effect of really parental attributes, and especially having really not a wealthier like parent, but having a parent with any wealth on becoming a homeowner? So, we've, kind of the idea there and the easy story, which has been told as far as down payment assistance. It also could be that a parent maybe that has had, as far as like housing wealth, knows how to, just become a homeowner, as far as like, just navigation of the lending markets. The second contribution is somewhat like unique for our paper. And what about the maintenance of wealth and as far as like homeownership? So in some sense, homeownership, as a lot of people know, is not the steady state that once you get it, unfortunately, it's fragile. And for some households, it's more fragile, than others. How do parental attributes and importantly their wealth really, just impact the likelihood that you can stay in the house, given that you, just achieve it, with the idea being that there's larger initial equity, but you also get the provision of emergency loans. So if somebody loses their job, maybe a parent can help provide a loan or a short-term loan, which helps, I just through that job loss, I just get through. And then at the very end, once you account for some of these differences in parental wealth, how much is really left of this gap? And more importantly, what's left that you can't explain of this gap? So as far as the research design, and I won't go too much into it, but I really use this novel data set that's all about the parents over the age of 50 and their adult, like the children under age of like 50. So, and again, the whole idea of this data set from 2000 through as far as like 2012 is over those 12 years, who became and stayed a homeowner, where again, we're looking at kind of individual demographics, but also parental attributes. More importantly, I just control for the likelihood of becoming a household. Again, as we saw at the end of 2020, the idea of being a household just to be eligible to be a homeowner you should just account for that. And in fact, some of the non-white households, has dissolved at a faster rate than white households. So you need to just account for that as well. So one of the trickier parts of this, and what's somewhat a challenging part of this research, is when you start talking about as far as racial groups, it's really hard for, I think, an individual sometimes to describe their own racial group or identity. I think it's harder to do that from their parents, and really have great racial identity of the parents, up to 26 different sort of categories. But how do we view that as a child, which is obviously a composite of their parents? So I kind of cheated. So I basically kind of stuck to three main racial groups. One was at least having one parent, which was Black, non-Hispanic, at least one parent Hispanic, let it be white, Black, or other. And last is really only white, kind of non-Hispanic parents. And I, kind of, since there's all these other categories, if somebody only had a child, had as far as parents only identified as other, we did our best to exclude them from the sample. So what you see here, and I think should not be a shock to people here, is what's the differences really between white and African-American households in becoming a homeowner. So we know what gaps exist, and a large gap exists. So what you see in the blue is really the average. So in 2000 through 2004, of all households that were renters, 37% of them became a homeowner really within that period. If we look at, those with only as far as white parents, that 42% of them came, but those that had at least one non-white parent in this case, only 27% of them did. So if you see this gap, it's really about a 15 percentage point gap in really becoming a homeowner over this period. And what you see really over the next 8 years is this gap essentially stays as far as steady, roughly about 15% over the next 4 years. Actually, as far as decreases, as far as to 7 point as far as 4% during the Great Recession.
Dr. Erickson.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have a question. So, and I don't want you to get off of these slides because the question pertains to what you're talking about.
Yeah, happy to.
So
please.
The question is from Yvette Fleetwood, and she wants to know if your research shows that basic life insurance practices as a means to increase wealth among whites has outpaced African Americans and other races. So
life insurance practices? I'm not sure. Did you say life insurance? Sorry, I missed it. I didn't see that.
Right. She has basic life insurance practices. Let me just.
So, I mean, that could relate to bequests, is how she's pertaining to. I'm not entirely sure what she's asking. I mean, to be honest, I would hate to respond to a question that I don't fully understand.
Okay. Well, I'm going to get clarification. So just proceed.
Okay. And please just continue. Just interrupt me as far as clarifications.
She says purchasing life insurance as a means to pass along wealth.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways to pass along that wealth. I think what I'm really looking at in this paper, though, is as far as intra vivos, which is really within. So this would be a parent who's maybe over the age of 60, who has a 40-year-old, child. How does the parent's wealth at 65 then transfer into their kids while they're still alive? And again, that's what I'm really focusing on this paper. I have another paper which I'm just as far as finishing up. Which as far as about bequests. And it's actually a very interesting question because we're about to undergo probably the largest wealth transfer that we ever had in as far as this country. Somewhere around 20 as far as the trillion dollars, let it be commercial or residential real estate. And life insurance is definitely an important component of those bequests. So hopefully I answered that. Please ask for a follow-up question. Happy to talk about that. So what I hope to say on the slides right now is there's this gap. And at least through, as far as the Great Recession, it actually decreased. And again, this could be viewed as a victory. It's actually through the Great Recession, really everybody decreased. And it was just, less for, non-white households, than not. So again, this is what leads to those gaps is this differences in becoming, and it's still real. It's still about, 11.4%. So if we would then try to say, okay, well, if we have these individual attributes, right? What predicts the likelihood of somebody just becoming a homeowner, right? What about it is about themselves or their parents? So what's not surprising, those that had a higher income and those that had more education also were more likely just to become as first homeowners during the next 4 years. But even if you try to throw everything in, including wealth, you still see this gap actually for those that have, an African-American like a parent. And again, it's about 13-14%. Studies would say, if you throw everything you could possibly think of, the fact you're not able to do away with that, that's evidence of discrimination or some sort of kind of third party, intervening factor. What's interesting though, is while there is a gap for it, as far as having, a Hispanic parent, that actually, once you control for education and income, that disparity mostly does go away. So what's unique in this, and I think kind of the open-ended question is, well, what specific role of parental wealth? And what you see is I just kind of, did bins here, and not surprisingly, those that had more financial wealth and those that had more, as far as housing wealth, and particularly these are the parents, right? Their kids controlling for everything else we could think of were more likely, just become a homeowner. And again, this describes this idea of maybe providing a down payment or the expertise just to become a homeowner, right? That financial, as far as the discipline that, how that goes on. So nothing's too surprising here, I think. What maybe I think is important though, is if we look at really the differences of parental wealth by race. So in the last model, we control for wealth, but I think it's important to realize that there's a lot of factors correlated with wealth. And what you see here in red is really the percent of wealth, of housing wealth, retirement, and as far as non-retirement wealth for both, white and non-white kids. And again, one of the things that I think jumps out of me to this is not only, the large differences in housing wealth, which we somewhat expected. It's actually, and I think it's an interesting, point, still, over almost 55% of those with non-white parents, right, still had some sort of housing wealth, right? And again, this is sort of unique again, because we're looking at the parents of adult, the children, which was really quite sad here was, when we're really looking at retirement wealth or non-retirement financial wealth, right? That's when we see 75% of, those with non-white parents have less than 25,000 as far as retirement wealth. And, and particularly, as far as 85% don't have any, or have less than 25,000. And this is the checking accounts. This is kind of the emergency funds that you see. So again, this is sort of the transmission that we see. So then the last thing is, well, what happens if we throw everything in a model? What explains what? So how much does differences in parental wealth between races and the the parental identities really explain this gap? And first thing just to know is my models explain about 60% of this gap. It doesn't explain 40% of that gap. And the way to think about that 40% is, again, that's evidence of discrimination. That's evidence of, or has been as far as evidence in the past of what's not in my model, right? I can't control for disparate treatment or disparate impact. I can just kind of control for what's in the data. So 40% I can't measure, 60% that I can. And really it looks, 25%, almost half of what I can't explain is really, due to, in this case, differences in as far as parental wealth. And this is the 4 years before they became a homeowner or were at risk to become a homeowner. So again, kind of taking a step back, this sort of helps says, well, we talk a lot about differences as far as education and, income, but, having a parent that could provide a loan for a down payment, provide basically, maybe, as far as the income, like a cushion is, really important. So, what about remaining a homeowner? And in my sense, I actually feel this is probably the most important disparity. So these are the households that became homeowners, and I was actually surprised. It says before subprime, as far as lending, only 82% of them really maintained who started a homeowner in 2000 ended in 2004 as far as a homeowner. That was a pretty shockingly low number. I was expecting to be much higher really for everybody. But it shows this churn that when we look at, like disparities in levels, right? There's a story behind it. And again, the story here is a lot of like minorities are able to become owners, but why can't they like maintain it? And, not surprisingly, you see a decrease between 2004 through 2012, but much more for these minority like homeowners, where again, it goes from 82% all the way down to 77%. So only about 3/4, through the 2008 through 2012. So again, what's also important too is I think during that time period of 2008 through 2012, we actually see the failure to maintain homeownership actually being a larger share of that gap. So you really see a crisscross. Both are about 11.5%. Like contributing, so differences in becoming a homeowner and differences just maintaining as well. So if we start talking about maintaining homeownership, like what are the like the correlates of this? First thing just to realize again is really the difference of control for everything. There's still a disparity left over as far as like the parental racial identity. So again, an ideal model, right, with no discrimination, you'd expect that to go to zero. It still like persists. I don't know like the mechanism of that per se. It's kind of unknown still. But what we do see obviously is the financial wealth and the housing wealth, where again, that helped you maintain having a parent that had more wealth to kind of start the 4 years of when you're at risk. So what do we see again if the decomposition? Roughly again, we explained about 60% of the variation. But now you see in fact that even a greater share and importance of really having a parent having, just not more housing wealth, but more liquid wealth, really help those kids just weather the storm, right? And again, I think this is important to say, yeah, I can explain, roughly half of what I can with parental housing wealth, but still there's 40% left that I can't explain. So, what I hopefully showed you just a little bit, was a peek into my research. In some sense, I think it's easy for us to say, hey, there's this large persistent gap, but we got to figure out, what leads into it and what keeps people away from, the convergence. What are some implications of this? One I think is absolutely true is differential access to as far as like the credit markets. This is the bank of mom and dad. This is the idea that by having a parent with some sort of financial assets. And again, maybe this is also the education of mom and dad as well, that they're able to provide that initial kind of capital. And maybe in fact, it shows for the households that are able to become homeowners and stay homeowners, maybe this actually shows that credit markets are still not perfect, right? There is still some implicit or disparate impact of lending as far as like practices. And again, having a mom and dad helps, that's cheap like collateral. But at the same time, right, maybe there's a role for someone else in the fintech sphere, just to be able just to work in there. The other thing, and I look forward to the discussion of this is, I think, the bank of mom and dad and parental wealth is really a legacy of past discrimination, right? And in some sense, this is a transmission like mechanism that says, even if we lived out a world today where everybody's treated as far as like justly, yesterday has an impact on today's, like as far as like the generations of today. And I think if you haven't read it, book, like fantastic book, which is by Richard Rothstein, as far as at UC. He has this great book called The Color of Law, and he distinguishes really two things. So we hear about as far as like redlining a lot, and we talk about as far as like redlining, we usually, and most people think of the practice of banks to simply say, we're not going to lend to this neighborhood, right? And again, we could chat about why they did this, and like it wasn't just, really by any regards, but what's important is that's de facto like discrimination. And Justice Roberts recently said, you can't hold the state accountable for differences in private, as far as like private choices and decisions, right? So basically the Supreme Court has kind of dug in their heels and said, look, you can't hold the state and the government like accountable for something that we did not create, right? Disparities we did not create. What's important about this book, and I think it's a must read for anybody kind of in this world, is it actually argues that discrimination was as far as like a, more or less actually created by state action. This was like the, like de jure. And what's important is Justice Roberts himself is on record saying, look, from de jure kind of instances, right? There's no longer the Constitution, the government's not responsible. They are required just to remedy like this situation. So again, we think about banks like discriminating. What we don't think about as far as the government like discriminating. So if you're familiar with the homeowners like loan corporation, and as far as, I think the author of the book did a very elegant job describing it, but from 1933 through 1954, there are structural races in the United States created by the government, and particularly how it operated through this idea of the government going through and kind of rating, as far as like neighborhoods. And this would impact like your likelihood of getting an FHA loan, or as far as VA lending as well. So basically, if you were in a neighborhood that was viewed as high risk, right, it would be perhaps impossible to apply your FHA loan to that neighborhood. So what do I mean? This is, what you see on the screen as far as, which is more the Baltimore, Maryland area. You see these colors, right? Which is, which really is the origins of redlining, which is actually from the federal government. This was a government institution that would go through. And what it would say essentially is the white neighborhoods in 1933, 85% of them were given the best rating, which meant the most preferential lending terms to borrowers. And again, versus if you look at minority neighborhoods, 64% of them were declared as far as hazardous or toxic. And in this case, you would actually be unable to just apply your lending and FHA loan to those neighborhoods. What this do, kind of equilibrium? Arguably, it did not provide that wealth that we saw, that really was enabled through the FHA that took place in the 40s and 50s. Entire neighborhoods, if they choose to live in that neighborhood, were left out. And without a doubt that those were minority as far as neighborhoods. And as far as Rothstein, I think, makes clear, this is clear evidence of, a government created situation that they need to fix. So thank you very much for your time. I'm really passionate about my research. So thanks for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Erickson. I appreciate that. So we have George Middleton. He has joined us and he is our next speaker. So before he gets started, let me introduce Mr. Middleton. Mr. Middleton is a mental health counselor who holds a BA from the School of Music at Indiana University, an MSM in management from Indiana Wesleyan University, and an MS in human services from Capella University. He is author of 3 books, one of which is Can You Be American and of Color Too? Living Outside of Race, Transitioning from Color to Culture, Addressing the Connection Between Mental Health and the Social Impact of the Race Construct. He conducts regular workshops to service providers toward the goal of increased cultural relevant services. And also through unique and therapeutically creative methods involving music and arts, Mr. Middleton has developed a series of workshops, seminars, and instructional aids that are designed to connect, engage, and challenge today's youth, adults, and families to reevaluate and reassess their thinking, leading to more effective behaviors. Mr. Middleton will discuss race ideologies and human capital's impact on wealth building and business growth. And once Mr. Middleton has finished his presentation, then we will open it up for questions for both Dr. Erickson and Mr. Middleton. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Middleton. I'm sorry if I messed up the title of your book, but you can correct me on that.
No, you were close. You just, it was just one word. Can you be American and a color too?
Let me just say this, Dr. Erickson, we need you to stop sharing your screen. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
And you can hear me okay, right?
Yes. Go ahead, Mr. Middleton.
Okay, great.
Yes.
So thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to have to put you on my traveling list for introductions on the rest of the places that I go to. Yes. So good morning.
Okay, I'm ready to go whenever you are.
All right. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I definitely appreciated the way that Mr. Erickson, Dr. Erickson had set this up. So I want to provide the correct or a relevant context in this discussion, as this is about disparities. So I'm going to ask 4 questions, actually, that I want you to think of as we're having this discussion. First question is, do you believe that race is a genetically valid category? Think about that. Some of you may already have answers to that. Do you believe that race is a genetically valid category? Second question. This is very personal to you. And in all these questions, I just want you to be authentic. This is not a gotcha moment. We're not trying to, pass you or fail you. How do you personally identify? Do you identify by color, or do you identify by culture? How do you identify? Do you personally identify by color, or do you identify by culture? Third question. Is it possible that your belief in race and your use of a racial identity systemic impact? And then the last question, if race isn't a valid category, why are we using it? And I think these are really important questions. They may seem totally unrelated to the topic of this discussion. So my goal is hopefully that I can establish that connection. COVID-19 has basically revealed our thought process and our behaviors. So the theme of COVID-19 right now is disparities. It's revealing disparities across all systems, to the point where some cities and states are pronouncing racism as a. Here in my city, it has been established in Indianapolis. It has been declared officially by the City County Council racism as a public health crisis. The challenge, however, is how do you intervene?
Mr. Middleton.
Yes.
Mr. Middleton, before you continue, can you just repeat question number 3, please?
Sure. Is it possible that one's belief in race and one's racial identity will have impact on systemic outcomes? So,
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So as I was saying, COVID has basically revealed our thought process and our behavior, the way we've seen each other and treated each other. And in my city of Indianapolis, racism has now been declared a public health crisis. How do we properly intervene? What is the proper, effective intervention for a public health crisis titled racism? It's not like COVID-19. You can't wear a mask to keep from getting it. It's not an airborne virus. You can't social distance yourself from racism. So how do you effectively intervene? In most public health crises, the response is a threefold strategy. It is prevention, mitigation, and repair. So with COVID-19, you prevent by wearing masks. You mitigate by social distancing and keeping yourself in exclusive places so that you don't spread the virus. And then you repair by vaccines and hospitalization, therapeutics, and all that. So that's easy enough there. But how do you take that strategy over to a public health crisis of racism? So I submit to you that the reason I asked you these 3 questions is because race ideology is a virus but it is a virus of mind. It's not an airborne virus. It's an internal thinking process virus. So when COVID-19 first hit, and this disparities, you just started hearing about disparities everywhere. I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what disparities is. You know, it's a twofold word. DIS, this, the prefix, which means the opposite of. So whatever you put that by, it's the opposite of that word. Parity, which means the state of equality. So when you put dis and parity together, you have the opposite of equality. Now, what happens a lot when you're in discussions on issues of race and disproportionate and disparities comes up, the average person will attribute disparities to the individual. But it's important to know that disparities are not a reflection on the individual behavior. Disparities are a reflection on the system's behavior. And often what happens is people attribute disparities and outcomes to the individual. And so they say, well, you just need to work harder. You just need to stop doing this. Well, you need to stop having babies out of wedlock. You need to pull your pants up. You need to do all these things that are individual, and that's not the solution. And even what we do as a racial community will say, well, if we just work harder, if we just support each other, if we just do this, if we just do that. Now, I'm not saying those aren't good things to do, but that's not the solution to a problem of disparity. So when you have a systemic problem, you need a systemic solution. And what we've been doing is attacking a systemic problem from an individual workshop or program. So if you're not clear on these terminologies, you're going to work hard and still find yourself in the same place, or as the statistics of Dr. Erickson show, you're going to be losing ground, which is what we're doing. We're collectively losing ground. And it's not that we're not working, but we're not working effectively. So race, as I said, is a virus. Race is an ideology. It is an ideology of white supremacy. Now, when I say that, I'm not saying that from a position of finger pointing, good guy versus bad guy, moral versus immoral. This is purely objective history. Race was created in the 1600s by the European for the purpose of the transatlantic slave trade, for economic exploitation. So the ideology is a hierarchy of value, of human value. And and based on skin color and body type. So the skin color that is at the top of the food chain, of course, is white. At the bottom of the food chain is black. And this ideology was created by the European so that he could justify the barbarous style of slavery that the European was going to introduce to the inhabitants of Africa. Now, moving fast forward, in 1865, when slavery was abolished, the identity by skin color, that continued. So it's really important to know that, because many of us operate that race has just been since the beginning of time. And there is a definite start period for race ideology, the 1600s. And because we had several generations into identifying by skin color, just because slavery was abolished, the mindset of identity was not. And when COVID hit, and it was apparent that businesses were going to take a hit, they came up with the stimulus package. In an article I wrote, I just want to give you this little piece of information. The COVID stimulus paycheck protection program to keep small businesses with fewer than 500 employees afloat. However, many small business owners were systemically frozen out due to a lack of a substantive relationship with their banks.
Mm-hmm.
In the first round, there were 71 publicly traded companies that received funding from the Small Business Administration's $349 billion Paycheck Protection Program before the money ran out. In total, these publicly traded companies received $300 million of emergency loans. The PPP application for self-employed individuals and independent contractors wasn't even to become available until less than a week before the program ran out of money. Banks tended to provide loans to their existing customers with whom they had strong relationships.
Mm-hmm.
When it came to minority-owned businesses, relationships or lack thereof had a significant impact. To get those loans out quickly, banks prioritized the customers they knew best, which tended to be larger, more established business. So the title of this article that I wrote is titled "The COVID-19 Revealed the Disparity of Relationship." So just think about that. That's a belief system. You know, the people you hang out with, the people who you value, right? And here is a system of financial support that obviously has shown, at least on a subconscious basis, who it values. Ms. Davis had sent an article to me on Redlining I thought was very relevant, and this is another example of how race ideology impacts systemic behavior. The title of the article is Redlining and Neighborhood Health. In the introduction, it reads, "The United States developed a deeply segregated society, the results of which are evident in the separation of communities we see today. Urban areas are often starkly divided by income and race. These divisions circumscribe the choices available to individuals. Racial and economic residential segregation entwine in their impact on the opportunities and health of Black and Hispanic Americans. Economic segregation defines the availability and quality of services, amenities, and educational employment opportunities at the neighborhood level. The adverse economic impacts are compounded by racial segregation in many ways that systematically weaken social and economic opportunities, especially those of Black Americans." So again, I would really like you to consider the questions I'm asking you, because it seems like we all know that the problem is attributed to race, but then when we focus on the solutions, we totally skip race and go to what can we do? And everybody knows the overused cliche now, what the definition of insanity is. So I'm wanting to really challenge our thought process before we start looking at what are the tangible things we can do to start at the beginning of the problem and let's rethink our situation. I watched part of the first session today by Dr. J.C. Baker, and he runs the business hospital. So he had a treatment plan, and there's three components of his treatment plan that I resonated with. One was a mindset. It was called the Adaptive Leadership Assessment. And the first component is the mindset you have to approach unique circumstances. Number two is the pre-crisis operation. And number three is embracing and mobilizing others to embrace an evolution to thrive under challenging circumstances. So just with the first one, what I'm really focusing on right now is the mindset. And so when I ask you these questions, I'm asking you not to change your mind, but for you to be more aware of how you're thinking. So the first question, is race real? That will determine how you perceive and treat others based just purely on an ideology, which is an ideology of white supremacy. Let's remember that. And I don't mean to be offensive in that, because on both sides of the color scheme, white and black, they are both racial identities, and they both have consequences. All right. So it's not that one is better or worse than the other, but it is an ideology of white supremacy. So remember that. So now when you take on a racial identity, you are really accepting that ideology. You're really taking your place on the hierarchy of race that has been set. So that's the premise that I wanted to lay down, and wanted to open up the floor to discussion on if you see that this change of mindset from our racial perspective to a non-racial perspective as something that you would entertain that would be important in the solution that we're trying to arrive at dealing with disparities.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Middleton. Let me see. I don't see any questions in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to Dr. Erickson. We're going to loop back around and try to tie everything together. So Dr. Erickson, you spoke about home ownership rates and disparities. I also read your paper that you sent me, and you talked about generational wealth and then the educational gap. And I've read several articles about the educational gap. And it's not so much the educational gap where do you have a high school diploma or you have a master's degree, but then the educational gap consists of business knowledge, business acumen, right? Are you astute within the business ecosystem? Do you understand what is required of you within that system? Can you elaborate on that for me, please?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I think a lot of times when we talk about an individual, right, and I think, honestly, homeownership is probably, we all view that homeownership is kind of the ends of itself, right? And I always generally view it's one of many assets that an individual should have, right? It is usually a property. It means you're not renting. It may or may not appreciate, hopefully it is. But I would also say the same with our human capital and our assets of kind of how we think about between generation from one to the next. So one of the big caveats of my research that I like to say is, I'm very confident, my result of, parental wealth matters, right, for becoming a homeowner. It's not because it has a direct effect. It's the fact that, well, maybe something in the previous generation that led to that wealth, maybe an importance of education, maybe an importance of, something that's correlated with it. So, again, I think you always want to be really careful of that. And how do we build that? And I think, as you said, it's not necessarily about a degree. That's kind of a state of knowledge. I am a director of a real estate, like a center, and, do a lot as far as education in these regards. And I think, people always say, oh, well, just tell me how to flip a house or very, very start there. And I think, no, you have to take a step back and say, well, what is your skill set and how do we build upon it? Right. And I think, that's partly the role of educators, but it's also the role of parents as well. And I think, unfortunately, starting and that intervention today could lead to future generations, not just because of the wealth, but because of the educational differences. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yes. And so thank you. And Mr. Middleton, can you expound upon that from your perspective as far as the educational gap being a disparity and having a negative impact on business ownership? We understand owning a home is a great way and for people to, if they don't have that generational wealth, to take some equity out of their home to start a business. But a home in itself is not an asset. It is a liability because there is money constantly coming out of your pocket that goes into maintaining that home. So I guess we could also argue, is it a positive thing for all people to own a home? Not everyone, as Dr. Erickson, as you said in our conversation, that not everyone should be a homeowner. So from Mr. Middleton, from your perspective, how does education impact ownership?
you have this in any system, you have the same patterns of disparity and outcome of by color. So in education, that is one of the primary areas from a racial perspective, that the racially Black demographic is going to suffer from, because we have no controlling influences in that system. Nothing in our systems of education are culturally relevant and supporting to what is relevant to us and our experiences. And we're already systemically set up to be in last place. So you just pick any area of education, it does, even in affluent areas, you will see that differentiation by color in outcomes by race. So it doesn't matter what socioeconomic level you want to make these comparisons in, you're going to see that striation of difference in race. And so that means that if you're in last place, you're not going to know as much as the person who is above you. You're just not going to know it. In addition, you're not going to have the support that is really required. There is this perception of individual pull it up by your bootstraps, your own bootstraps, when actually, when you have a system behind you, you can look the part like you're doing it by yourself, but you're really not. You have a whole system behind you that even at your worst, if you're of the right skin shade, you're going to get that extra level hand-holding through the process, such as with the PPP program. Just because you don't know, you're not going to suffer from your lack of knowledge, because you're in a system that will automatically help you fill in those gaps. And only the most aggressive in our community will be able to kind of break through that barrier.
Okay, so we talked about, thank you for that. We talked about, you mentioned, both you and Dr. Erickson mentioned human capital, and that's where the education and the knowledge comes into play, and the need for business owners to continue to acquire new skills so that they can grow their business and maintain their business. So my question is, as far as the factors that contribute to smaller size firms by minority entrepreneurs, such as access to capital, which we talked about in the earlier session, or lower levels of education and business skills. What are some of now we're looking at, and we're going to get to your questions, what are some of the ways in which we can deal with the disparities that we see, the home ownership, the lack of generational wealth from our parents to their offspring, the educational acumen that is required for a business owner, the ability to leverage your human capital, but also the ability to work within different industries and focus on those particular industries and the potential that's available there. For example, one of the speakers in the previous session talked about how minorities tend to focus on real estate, retail establishments and service industries. So how do we look at these disparities that exist, that go back centuries, and create solutions or strategies to move forward? And so, Dr. Erickson, I know you said you weren't comfortable in dealing with the strategies, but I'm gonna toss it to you, and this is just your opinion. What do you think some of those strategies should be?
So, I mean, and the caveat there is, as an economist, I really specialize in looking in the past and really trying to analyze it. It's harder for me to come up with a prescription because I think there isn't one easy answer, right? And again, I think, I think what I would tell anybody as an economist is, right, play to your strengths, right? So we could talk about disparities and differences, as far as financial assets, and maybe that's correlated with homeownership, right? Now, a part of that's human assets, right? Yourself, and thinking about education and building upon that. And then I think the thing that's not talked enough about is really social assets, right? And I think In some sense, while some disparities are quite high, right? I think others, playing to the understanding of community and kind of, what self is, for a lot of people, I think that's to their advantage, right? And I think, I could chat and particularly as an economist, and particularly I do a lot of consulting for the government. And one of the things that I say a lot of times is, one of the things that really frustrates me, and I think for a lot of things, is that we really penalize assets. And if anything, we ignore the social aspects, the social capital of that, right? And I think, and again, I want to make sure that that I answer it well, but I think and I very much strongly agree with if the whole idea of bootstraps, it's actually supposed to be kind of a tongue-in-cheek kind of a statement, because you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? I mean, we talk about that all the time as a society, and the fact is you can't, right? You need someone to lean on and step upon, and again, I think that's probably a step in the right direction. A big thing that I would love to see government do is to not penalize asset accumulation. Let it be, through different like social programs. We really penalize emergency savings. And again, I think the problem with a lot of society is we do a good job of kind of having it's the people that are at one end of the spectrum and the other end of the spectrum, but we don't realize how to get to one end to the next, right? And I think that's through accumulating more assets through education. And again, I don't think that's degrees. I think it's as much more of just, improving yourself. And then I think the biggest thing that I would love to see policy do, at least going forward, is, I think the key to society are people, but at the same time, we need to invest in people and where people want to live. I think, in my own research, I find a lot of people talk about moving to low poverty neighborhoods and the importance of that for, moving to the next, kind of the next step. And I say, well, why can't we improve the communities and figure out why that community is high poverty and help that community improve itself? And again, it's happy to elaborate like the Fuller, but these are issues that at least I think about often. So.
And Mr. Middleton, do you have any comment on that?
On what he said, or the question that you asked?
The question that I asked.
Yeah, okay. So the solution, first it has to be awareness. It has to be awareness and acknowledgement. So in any dilemma that you have, that's the first step in any solution, towards any solution, is awareness and acknowledge. Awareness that you have the problem and acknowledging that you have the problem. Inside the race paradigm on any of these issues, from wealth to home ownership, you can't have you can't have wealth in a racial economic playing field without a racially collective economic plan of action.
Okay, can you expand upon that?
The systems that we're describing support one particular racial group over the other. They've got the ideology systemized. That's what racism is. It is a systemic implementation of the ideology. So just by having pure white pigmentation, it gives you an advantage in the economic playing field over those with darker pigmentation. And again, this is not a judgmental statement. This is not meant to make someone who may identify as white feel bad or feel guilty, because it's not about blaming and vice versa. But so you have to understand that the game is played on a racial basis. So you have one of two options. You can either continue to play the game on a racial basis, or you can step out of the racial paradigm and create a different game. That second strategy that I'm offering is the one that is directly challenging to the belief system of someone who identifies by color. If you identify as Black, your natural question is, as is in the theme of one of these questions that I want to address, is, well, everybody sees we're Black, so we have no option. We don't have a choice but to be Black. So we have to play this game. And so it's challenging that, because if someone created that game for your oppression, why would you want to continue playing that game? You
Okay,
never win.
so Mr. Middleton, let me just stop you right there. So
Okay.
it is a game that if you want to use the word game, and it has been instilled for centuries. Race has,
Mm-hmm.
And it is generational. That mindset is generational.
Correct.
And so you're asking for a group of people, the group that I identify with, African Americans, to somehow change their mindset to no longer perceive themselves as African American or Black, but then to perceive themselves as what? As other. And then, okay, once we perceive ourselves as other or something other than what we originally perceive ourselves as, how do we then go about changing the perception and the mentality of those around us who continue to perceive us as Black? So I'm trying to understand how it's sort of like you're swimming upstream.
Right.
You're trying to make the cognitive or conscious effort to change how you perceive yourself. But the world around you, and when I say the world, I mean the world in general. I just watched a documentary the other day about Peru, and you're looking at Peruvians, they call the natives, and then the Europeans that were there, and they're going through the same thing. So how do you take a group of people that are perceived as less than or of darker skin, and then change that perception in the world?
Right.
I mean, and continue to exist. I'm puzzled by that.
Great question. Okay, so let me just clarify. You packed a lot in that, so let me clarify the first part of the question. Black is a racial designation. African American is a cultural designation. So just that mind shift changes the paradigm, because right now we're throwing Black and race and culture together when they're actually the same. A cultural designation usually has a body of land associated with it, because culture refers to your environment and the practices and traditions you've used to help you cope and survive in your environment. So if someone says, I'm of German culture, you know the body of land that responds to. If someone says, I'm of Swedish culture, you know the geographic location that responds to. But when somebody says, I'm white, well, what geographic location does that respond to? If somebody says I'm Black, well, what geographic location does that respond to? Because you'll find various shades of skin tones all over the world in all different cultures. So it's important to know that distinction. And then I am not trying to get you to change, like I said earlier, I'm not trying to get you to change your identity. I'm trying to get you to increase awareness of which identity do you believe you are, and understand the differences. There is a difference between racial identity and cultural identity. And the thinking in racial terms is totally different than the thinking in cultural terms.
So I have a question from Barb Smith to you, Mr. Middleton. And on the same, she's aligned with what I basically said, but I'm going to read Barb's question. She says, Mr. Middleton, how do we move from race being a valid category and yet move to equality? Until we are classified as Americans and not Black American or white American, will true equality come to be? However, without programs, platforms in place for minority businesses will not have access to capital, projects, etc. Those things needed to help level the playing field.
Right. So to her first question, how do we move from race being a valid category yet move to equality? Well, the first step, and it might sound like I'm plugging myself, but I'm really not. The first step is to get either one of my workbooks, which spells out exactly how to do that. Because I'm approaching this from a mental health perspective. So I'm using evidence-based therapeutic strategies with which to empower the person who reads it on how to negotiate their environment. So it's more of, when you become aware, you become empowered. When you don't know what you don't know, then you feel you're limited in your choices. You feel that you have to take what somebody offers you. And listen, guys, our identity is the most important and most powerful tool that we have. And anybody you compete with knows that. So the first rule of any game is if I can get inside my opponent's head, that gives me a head's advantage. Whenever I talk about this, I'm always thinking about that scene in Roots where Kunta Kinte was strung up on a tree and the slave master was beating him until he accepted a different identity. He wanted to remain Kunta Kinte because that's where his power came from. That's who he knew he was. And the slave master knew if he did not beat that identity out of him, he was going to keep running. And for the slave master, a running slave is costly. You have to use expenses to go out and chase him down every time. So just knowing your identity is extremely important.
I guess my question to you, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
My question is, and Dr. Erickson, you jump in anytime you want. My question is, how do you, and I think what Barb Smith is asking, and I think I see a lot of people on here asking is, I can change how I perceive myself. I'm going back to my original, but I cannot, how do I change the disparities in the world that negatively impact my business and my ability to grow my business? I want to stay in that framework of being a business owner. So how do I do that? You know, we've talked about, you know, Dr. Erickson talked about redlining. He talked about home ownership, generational wealth, the transference of generational wealth down to our offspring as an advantage that white America has that we as African Americans do not have on a broad base level. So I'm changing how I perceive myself as a business owner. I'm no longer a minority business owner. I'm no longer an African American business owner. I don't know, Deborah.
Well, let me give you an analogy.
Okay.
To answer your question. Your name is Deborah Davis, correct?
That is correct.
That is your identity, Deborah Davis, correct?
Yes.
If I said, hi, Debbie, how would you feel about that?
I'm going to be honest with you. I have never liked being called Debbie because my name is Deborah. So I would probably correct you.
Right.
There are very few people that I allow to call me Debbie.
Exactly. So now that seems to be a very simple analogy, but here's the thing. You have no qualms with saying, hey, I'm going to correct you because you're perceiving me as a Debbie, and I'll have you know that is not who I am. Mm-hmm. And you're saying that with every full ounce of confidence and are willing to deal with the consequences because under no circumstances will you allow yourself to be referred to as a Debbie. Now, when you can take that same attitude about your own identity. Now, when I do this work, some people are going to say, I'm going to retain my racial identity. So again, I am not trying to force someone to change. What I'm trying to do is bring clarity to this race ideology so that you can make informed decisions on your own, on an authentic level. And 9 times out of 10, those decisions will align with your true values. So as a culture, as a racial group, we're the only racial group concerned about the perceptions of other people. Mm-hmm. No one else has that concern. And that is the one area that is holding us back because we can't fully play our strategy out if we're overly concerned about how others are going to perceive us, how others are going to treat us. If I'm competing, I know someone is going to come at me to try to block my progress. I know some people are going to try to cheat. I know some people are going to try to do all kinds of things to get a leg up. We already know that. But if I'm secure in my identity, then my strategy is going to be based on what I think of me versus what I think he thinks of me. And it's a big difference. And as a racially black community, we are overly concerned about, well, how are they going to see us? Will that make them change?
And I think what you're saying, Mr. Middleton, is that we all know what the disparities are. We all know what the obstacles are. And from what I hear you saying is the solution to that is not allowing yourself to be defined by those disparities or those challenges or those obstacles, but understanding who you are, what your goal is as a business owner, and moving forward in spite of those challenges, finding solutions and avenues around those challenges. And so I think that is what you are saying. Is that correct?
And not only that, but when you can delineate the difference between race and culture, you can also more effectively form your strategy.
Okay.
Because that's what this is all about. Is you may decide, you know what, I change from a racial identity to a cultural identity, but the game is still racial. So you still have to understand that you're going to go out, like you were saying earlier, people are still going to perceive you from a racial perspective. People are still going to treat you from a racial perspective. And you have to factor that into your strategy. But from the black side of the coin, when you internalize race, then when these microaggressions happen to you, it usually gets you emotionally off center. So now you're angry, you're ready to protest, you're ready to do all these reactionary things and cry out the unfairness of the behavior, which is really not effective for your strategy of moving forward.
Okay. I hear what you're saying. Let me see if there's any comments.
George, I have a question for you.
Go ahead.
So an issue that happens a lot in as far as lending, and I talk with a lot of really well-intentioned people, and think about credit scores. Do you get approved for a loan, right? And I think one of the challenges that's very much been faced in the literature is this idea of disparate treatment for disparate as far as like impact. And it's clear what disparate treatment is, and I think we agree overt discrimination is not okay, right? But I think the next step, at least from financial institutions thinking about this, is when does disparate impact occur? And again, the reason why I mentioned this is important is, as my own research would suggest, if we only give loans to individuals based on parental wealth, right, or we do some sort of external factor, right? It could be education,
redlining, or where they live, their zip code.
Exactly, right. That reflects a lot of the past disparities, right? And I think if you see, this is very much what I was trying very careful, it's not clear how to do that. And in fact, if you really did, the best study was done by the Federal Reserve Bank in Boston in the 90s, and they controlled for every single thing. And again, the whole goal was, end discrimination inside mortgage lending markets. And the fact was they really couldn't. And kind of where this literature went to, thinking about where to the next step we go, it's the fact that, and again, it's hard because how do you do this? But in a sense, you shouldn't, at least in financial lending institutions, ignore race or ethnicity, but actually realize the categorization of disparities within those. And the best case I can think of, George, is SAT scores. The SAT score, it's clear there's racial differences, and the question is that because of differences in ability or the questions that are being asked, right? And again, I don't have a simple answer, but I was curious what your thoughts would be for somebody who's out educating financial lenders and kind of, how to be fair and just. How should they think about this?
Great question.
Good question. Yeah.
Great question. So we have a tremendous opportunity right now. All of this happened because of a tragedy, which is the George Floyd situation. And I'm sure everyone here who identifies as Black has an experience where a person of white identity will call them and in all honesty and sincerity say, wow, I am just really upset, and I want to help, and I want to be part of the solution. This is horrible what's going on. I finally understand what you guys are going through. What can we do? I just don't know what to do. So this is an opportunity to actually do this. And that's why I kind of sound like the boy who cried wolf, because no one is speaking and looking at race and racism from a mental health perspective the way that I'm promoting it. In these systems, as I'm challenging those who identify by Black, I'm also challenging those who identify by white. You don't realize it, but you are victims of race ideology as well. But the symptoms display differently. And because you can look and see that someone is in worse position than you, you feel that you are the benefactor. So, and that was purposely designed so that we would never meet and work together. So the fact that you're here trying to be part of the solution, that says this is an opportunity to find a different way to work together. So my goal is twofold with regard to the two identities of race. On the Black side, the internalization of not being empowered. I'm challenging that identity coin to say, you have more power than you're giving yourself credit for, but as long as you embrace and internalize a Black racial identity, you'll never capitalize on the really strong level of empowerment that you have, because you're not a skin color. Then on those who identify as white, who are in these places, in these systems, for those who are really sincere about wanting to make change. We don't need you out there protesting. We need you in your areas of influence to say, hey, you know what? Here's the systemic behaviors that I no longer am going to support, or I'm going to be active in addressing, right? So it calls for action. Everybody's been trying to throw money at the issue through diversity and inclusion training, and I'm not against diversity and inclusion training, but it's already been shown it doesn't work. You get short-term behaviors, and then people go right back to their default belief systems. This is a time now to align who we say we are with our values. And that's why my book is named the way it is. Can you be American and a color too? Because the country really is at a fork in the road with regard to who it decides it's going to be. And
So,
this is the time to be conscious and clear with that intention.
So, Mr. Middleton and Dr. Erickson, I did some reading as well, and I appreciate your comments, Mr. Middleton, and I was interested in what are some of the short-term recommendations that can be implemented to help, small to medium-sized businesses, minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses. And so what I found is that and I'm just going to read the laundry list. One of the things is looking at databases that track trends and disparities. Okay, so that would be good, because once you start tracking those trends and disparities, then you can see, as they've done in the past, you can see what the impact is, and then you can create solutions as it relates to those impacts. And I appreciate your feedback from both of you when I finish. I have to do this quickly. Another one is expand targeted efforts to improve access to property structure credit for entrepreneurs of color. So deliberate and cultural competent outreach and service to communities of color. And I don't think that is happening. I know a lot of banks have money, I forgot what they call that, where they're required to work within the minority communities. But I don't really see that coming to fruition in the way that I feel that is really beneficial or helping minority communities as far as putting money within those communities. So another one is apply loan underwriting and decision-making approaches that address the credit characteristics of many minority-owned firms. So, for example, community development financial institutions, they have expertise in responsibly underwriting and making loans to businesses with these credit deficiencies. So looking at how we can take their business owners' credit deficiencies and maybe apply underwriting that will not discredit them, but provide them an opportunity, an avenue, a path to gaining funds, gaining that access to capital so that they can then invest it in their business. And there is also structuring loans differently. I also did some research where one gentleman is a business owner, and he's looking at the rent, because as Dr. Erickson said, a lot of people of color don't own homes, but can you take their rent and use that as as a way to establish credit. So we know if you pay your mortgage on time, then that increases your credit score, right? That's a way to establish credit. But what about taking your rent, if that's a possibility, to use that as a way to establish credit? So then it creates another path, another avenue of getting access to credit, so that access to capital, so that you can then invest in your idea or your business, grow your business, inventory, whatever it is that you need. So just looking at some of these initiatives, there's joint venture, there's addressing capital, like we talked about in the other session, of cash flow challenges. So do either one of you have any comments on this? And I'm not able to go through everything that I researched, but those are just some of the things that I found that could be strategies in helping business owners to get that access, to deal with some of the systemic racist policies that have been implemented in this country for centuries, that have basically not allowed people of color, specifically African Americans and Latinos, to take advantage of those opportunities. So any feedback or comment on what I just said quickly?
George, you want to go first?
Sure. I would say all of those strategies are great. What I would add to that as the basis is to support your local Black Chamber of Commerce. Be an active and aggressive supporter. As long as the game is played on a racial field, we're going to have to address racial strategies. And the Black Chamber of Commerce has to be the basis and foundation. And what I found, as I'm a member of my chamber, and it's interesting that the surrounding community is not naturally supportive of their Black chambers in these cities. And we have to start there first. That is our economic foundation, our chambers of commerce, because we're competing against other groups that have much more effective chambers of commerce. From the Hispanic group, you pick any other culture, they have a very strong network in their chambers that precedes everything, supports all these strategies that you just listed. It supports all of those, and then they can go to one centralized place and get that support.
Yeah.
Dr. Erickson?
No, I think that's, like great advice. And, there's two things I want to say. One is, I think it starts with people, right? It starts with education, both informal and informal ways. I would love, and I think one of the ways that we could start breaking down barriers is honestly getting more people of color into some of these financial institutions. I think starting young and understanding, in some sense, it's easy. It's actually, take that back. It's very hard for me to help educate institutions and how to be thinking about, how do we change disparities? When we can try to change it from within, is maybe one way to view it. The other way that I would encourage anybody, and I think I would say this to anybody in any circumstances, is realize the informational problem that people have, right? So a lot of credit scoring models, they're imperfect. There's no such thing as a perfect credit modeling. It's all about prediction. And I think in some sense, understanding what goes into these models, right? And I think, Anne in the last session did a good job of kind of describing of, you got to have a business plan, right? And maybe realize maybe there's a stigma of whoever, racial group you're a part of, but at the same time, realize, play that to your advantage, right? And I mean that in the sense of the community and understanding a market and kind of marketing in that sense, just kind of educating yourself, but also others, basically in the opportunities. So, thank you.
Okay. All right. Let me just see if there are any. Let's see.
Yeah, Rachel just left one, and it's very relevant if we have a minute to address that, because that.
Let me just
go right ahead.
Are you going to read it? You going to read it?
I can read it, sure.
Okay, go ahead.
If you like. Rachel says not all Black chambers of commerce provide the assistance needed. This may be due to lower membership levels. However, the assistance is not always available to help some businesses access resources or advance in industries. So that is a spot on issue that's afflicting many city and state Black chambers of commerce. We have a perception problem, everybody, as it relates to Black chambers of commerce. Black anything is going to have a perception problem. Black Lives Matters. Anything you want to put Black on, you automatically step into a perception problem. And not just from those of white identity, you're having a perception problem from those of Black identity, because it's the Black identity that will say, well, I'm not putting my money with them because I've had these negative experiences and I'm just not going to do it. Listen, guys, we have to be aware of our racial thinking. We are being programmed to think negatively of ourselves, and so we don't support ourselves. And we have to, when you talk about your Black Chamber of Commerce, that is a reflection on you. And I'm not saying that to you, Rachel, because I know that's not what you're doing. But when you say, well, they're this or they're that, and that's a reflection on how much you're supporting or how much you're not supporting your Black Chamber of Commerce. We can no longer afford to just point fingers and say, well, until they do something. This is personal. We have to all have skin literally in the game. And as long as we're dealing with race, we have to have a racial strategy. So understand the difference between race and culture, decide who you are, and then play an effective strategy. And you can't have an effective strategy without an economic base. And in the Black community, your Black chambers of commerce are your economic base. And if they're not strong enough, then you need to individually get in there and help strengthen it up.
Okay. And as a person who is employed by the African American Chamber of Commerce, I appreciate that. Let's see here. We have, are there any more questions? No, I don't see any more questions. All right, we are at the end. We have 2 minutes left. So I just want to thank both of you, Dr. Erickson and Mr. Middleton, for joining us today. And I appreciate your insight and your knowledge on the subject matter of disparities and how it impacts minority-owned businesses. Let's see. Rachel would like to know, is there contact information for the presenters? So yes, there is, Rachel, contact information, and we'll make sure that we get that out to you so that you can follow up if you would like to. All right.
And please reach out to me if you're interested in the garage certificate of real estate. I'm happy to share my slides and my research. So thanks. Thank you very much.
All right.
Alfred said he asked the question. Did we get his question in?
Let me see, Alfred. Alfred, can you see? Alfred, okay. So better, but they will not. Yes, Alfred asked a rather controversial question. Is this the question is that the same as going from I think this is reference to how we perceive ourselves as Black or African American. And as you know, we have sort of evolved from being Negro, colored, Black, African American. So what Alfred is asking is that the same as going from the N-word to color to Negro to Black to Afro-American?
Yes, he asked that question, and he just retyped in about disparity studies. So with the N-word, I hope everybody understands that Negro is Spanish for Black. Negro and Black, they're the same thing. And it's ironic because today, it's not really those of Black identity. Most of us don't want to be referred to as Negro. But it's ironic because they have the same meaning. Call me Black, but don't call me Negro. So just think about that. Think about the lunacy in the substance of that. I understand where it comes from, but really think about it. And neither of those names did we give ourselves. That was given to us by someone else, which is a number one problem of us as a racial demographic, because we're not even in control of our own identity. We're reacting to the perceptions of. And now, then his last question was, does disparity studies help this
Mr.
question.
Middleton, we're going to have
I'm
to
sorry.
take that offline. We are in the
Okay.
process. We're interrupting the next session. I want to thank everyone for being here today. Thank you for your input. We are now going to the impact of real estate development. So thank you again. Take care and enjoy the rest of your day. Stay with us. We have a next session coming up.
Thank you. Thanks, George.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Deborah.